Le prochain
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. The next candidate to speak will be Mr. Pierre Poilievre from the Conservative Party. 1 minute, please.
But first, let's get to the real issue. Why are housing prices skyrocketing in Canada? Well, it's actually pretty simple: supply and demand. We don't have enough houses, and that's a disgrace in a country that is the second largest landmass in the world and one of the most sparsely populated. The reason we don't have enough houses is because the same socialist politicians that want to spend great gobs of money building government housing have made it incredibly expensive to build private sector housing. In the city of Toronto, $186,000 of the cost of an average unit of housing is the cost of government, of fees, of delays, of permits, of charges, and of otherwise unnecessary costs that are imposed on the builder and then passed on to the buyer. We need a solution to address that problem, and I will be presenting that solution tonight. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Poilievre. It's now time for Madame Angela Keller-Herzog from the Green Party. 1 minute.
Thank you. The Green Party's campaign is about leadership. It's also about action. Housing is critical, that is clear. Federal incentives for purpose-built rental housing were eliminated in the 1970s, and we now face a national shortage of affordable housing, and as a result, a growing problem of homelessness and housing insecurity. The Liberal government's national housing strategy does not address immediate core housing needs across Canada. Funding for affordable housing will roll out over 15 years, but is extremely back-end loaded. It's past time that the Government of Canada moves to ensure that everyone has access to safe, affordable housing. The Green Party stands for federal support for co-ops, rental housing, social housing, and supportive housing. Let's make affordable housing a part of the leadership agenda.
Merci, Madame Keller-Herzog du Parti vert. Madame Geneviève Nadeau, dernière en liste.
Ms. Geneviève Nadeau of the Bloc Québécois. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me this evening. I'm going to start with a little biography. I'm Geneviève Nadeau, even though I'm very young. I've been in politics since the age of 15. The major issues for my involvement are social justice and the environment, two issues that are...
du logement au Canada. Un des premiers emplois que j'ai obtenu alors que j'ai commencé mon rôle d'intervenante sociale, c'est avec des jeunes de la rue de 16 à 22 ans à Montréal. L'organisme s'appelait Le Bon Dieu dans la rue et on accueillait au bunker des jeunes de 16 à 22 ans.
getting the cost of delivering new housing to market is really critically important. But the other part of it is to make sure that the people have access to that. And that's where the first-time homebuyers mortgage support and equity agreements come in. That's where the tax on foreign speculation into the resale market comes into effect. And it's where our movements to try and support new innovative ways to bring supply online is funded by those innovative strategies that my colleague referenced. This is the critical issue that must be addressed to create housing affordability.
Thank you, sir. Madame Nadeau.
Oui. En fait, quand on parle du fait que les maisons sont de plus en plus chères et aussi que le pourcentage du salaire de beaucoup trop de nos ménages canadiens sont investis dans le logement, moi, ça me répond, ça me fait réaliser que c'est parce qu'on n'a pas assez de logements abordables, on n'a pas assez de logements sociaux. Parce que c'est pas normal qu'une grande partie de notre population doit mettre plus de 40% de son salaire dans son logement. Il y a aussi une question de où est notre maison, où est l'endroit, j'allais dire location, mais l'endroit de notre maison. Et dans la lutte et au changement climatique, toute la question de l'environnement, elle vient rentrer en jeu là-dedans. Et il faut se dire, nous aussi, il faut qu'on fasse des efforts. Il faut qu'on habite les grands centres. Il faut arrêter de faire du développement de façon où on fait de l'étalement urbain, où ce qui coûte plus cher de construire des nouvelles infrastructures et où ce qu'on nuit à notre environnement. Donc moi, ce que je vous dis, c'est nous aussi, on doit s'investir là-dedans. Et si vous avez envie d'avoir votre maison dans un suburb, dans un quartier un peu plus éloigné, ça sera à vous de, assumer les coûts de ça.
Merci. Ms. Keller-Herzog.
Thank you. I find it quite stunning that the proposal that we've just heard from Mr. Pierre Poilievre, he's saying that he proposes a competition for the private sector to be as unfettered as possible. The private sector has obviously not been supplying affordable rental housing. This is the crisis that we're facing. So I think that he's driving the bus in the wrong direction. What we need is supportive policies such as direct investments, changes to tax policies, lending and granting programs, changing the mandate of CMHC, for example, not towards the creation of first-time homeowners, but to support those who have to rent. And we had those policies in the 70s, I think, under the young Trudeau of those days.
Thank you very much. I just want to follow up very quickly, and hopefully we'll go in the same order again. But there was a mention of that first-time homebuyers incentive that was brought in by this government. And I'd like to know, will your party either continue to support that program? And if not, what, if any, kind of program would you put in its place?
Yeah, I mean, our government is committed to that program, and I think one of the things you've seen in this election is a really important development to start taking CMHC policy and start to regionalize it. One of the things we understood after we launched it was that the impact in Vancouver and the greater Vancouver area, as well as in Toronto and much of the GTA, is that the metrics were off a little bit. And I think one of the most important things we can do in the next term of Parliament is to start to regionalize our housing approaches, because the one-size-fits-all tradition that has quite often defined national housing policy, in particular in the private sector, has not worked in different regions across the country. That change has now been signaled. I think it's one of the most important conversations to start as we move towards the next term of Parliament.
Mr. Poilievre?
Thank you very much. We would go beyond that to address some of the obstacles that the federal government has now put in place. The application of this new OSFI stress test is not just a problem for first-time homebuyers, but for renewals. The government is requiring that if you go for a renewal of your mortgage, that you will have to go through a stress test only if you change lenders. That means that a lot of people will be forced to stay with the same lender, and that lender will have a captive audience and be able to impose unfavorable terms on the borrower. That's why we think that if you've already been approved for a mortgage on a given house, you shouldn't have to go through a second stress test. You should be able to shop around for a mortgage with other lenders.
Thank you very much. Madame Nadeau?
Oui, bien sûr. En fait, oui, on voudrait continuer à aider les premiers acheteurs à acheter une première maison et je suis contente d'entendre mon collègue du Parti libéral dire qu'il a envie de régionaliser les enjeux parce que présentement, l'approche qui a été adoptée par le Parti libéral est pas mal one size fits all pour l'ensemble du Canada. Oui, moi, je suis assez d'accord avec l'idée d'un stress test où ce qu'on amène les gens à dire, est-ce que tu vas être capable de subvenir à cette maison-là en cas de crise financière? Je trouve ça correct parce que je n'ai pas le goût de vivre le même type de crise qu'on a vécu aux États-Unis. Par contre, on ne peut pas dire que cet enjeu-là qui a été répondu, il répondait surtout pour Vancouver puis Toronto, où ce qu'en Ontario puis en Colombie-Britannique, le prix des maisons a augmenté d'environ 13 %. Au Québec, ça a été juste 2 % d'augmentation. Donc, j'espère que le Parti libéral va vraiment aller de l'avant avec la régionalisation des enjeux parce que le stress test a beaucoup nuit aux Québécois dans ce cas-ci.
Merci. Ms. MacEwen?
Yes, so the NDP has proposed to double the first-time homebuyers credit. In terms of the stress test, you really want to make sure that you're not putting people in a situation where they're going to be losing wealth when the market changes, and making sure that you're not putting them in a situation where they'd be better off renting and saving up money.
And Ms. Keller-Herzog?
The Green Party would get rid of this approach altogether. We think that the first-time home buyer grant risks exacerbating housing speculations and commodification. And the financialization of the housing sector is precisely what has been driving up the rates. We instead would have green mortgages for the better maintenance and energy retrofitting of houses. And some of the retrofitting of houses would also make, at the bottom end of the pyramid, housing livable again, so creating additional units that are derelict. And we would also have financing for the creation of rental, supportive, social, and co-op housing.
Thank you very much.
So thank you. So for our second round, it will be on homelessness and the National Housing Strategy, and I'll direct my question firstly to Adam Vaughan and then give everyone else a chance to respond. So Mr. Vaughan, an estimated 235,000 Canadians experience homelessness every year, and over 1.7 million households are in core housing need. In 2017, your party introduced the National Housing Strategy, and in your last budget, passed a legislated right to housing, which is now law. Critics have pointed out that the promised National Housing Strategy funding is insufficient to deal with Canada's homelessness and is back-end loaded, pushed off to future years. Do you feel that the National Housing Strategy goes far enough? And if not, what else would your party do?
The investments we made in terms of fighting homelessness, we doubled them in our first budget, and we locked them in now and have signed housing accords across the country just about to make sure that those funds are there for the long term. In this campaign, we've started to step up again on the idea of supportive housing, which is what is needed to actually end homelessness. The $6 billion that's invested for supports around healthcare, in particular around mental health, these are the services that create supportive housing on top of the National Housing Strategy. The close to $700 million for addictions. These are the in-community, house-based, home-based supports that solve that part of the homelessness problem. As well, $15 million specifically for veterans homelessness. These are additional dollars to provide the services that make this supportive housing functional and will allow us to even get deeper into reducing homelessness across the country. In terms of the long-term stability of the funding, we also have to start to recognize that urban Indigenous housing is the most critical missing piece of the puzzle. The Urban Indigenous Infrastructure Program, the substantial step up on that front in this campaign, is aimed at delivering for the first time ever that urban Indigenous housing program. No other party platform speaks to it, ours does.
Ms. MacEwen, would you like to respond?
Sure. So it's interesting because Mr. Vaughan is bringing up again this national approach to homelessness. I think you've done some great things, and I think you're going in the right direction in terms of recognizing the housing first policy and the supports that you need to have in place for people. But they didn't double the homelessness funding of the average of the past 5 years. It was only a 60% increase. So they took a low year and made it sound like they did a great job by doubling it. The money that's in place right now simply is not enough to meet the scale of the crisis. We need a much bigger investment. The investment that we've got, the average investment, is going to leave, there's no evidence actually that it's going to make those dents that they claim it's going to make. In fact, it's about a tenth of what they're promising that it looks like the evidence is showing us. The Parliamentary Budget Officer reviewed it, and they did a very good job of researching it.
Okay. Madame Nadeau?
Oui. En fait, je dois différer un peu ici de ma collègue du Nouveau Parti démocratique. Pour moi, l'approche que le fédéral du Ottawa knows best avec le Housing First, c'est pas une approche qui est adéquate pour les Québécois. Nous, au Québec, on avait déjà une approche beaucoup plus intégrée. Quand on parle de lutte à l'itinérance, on parle pas juste de mettre un toit sur la tête de quelqu'un. On parle aussi de s'assurer qu'il vit en communauté. On parle aussi qu'il y a des soutiens en santé mentale, parce que c'est difficile. Et si je fais juste dire, je t'ai trouvé un appartement, je te le subventionne, mais qu'il est seul dans cet appartement-là sans soutien, ça ne fonctionnera pas. Donc, au Québec, on a déjà développé notre spécificité et j'espère que le gouvernement du Canada va nous transférer les fonds et nous laisser continuer et peut-être même apprendre de nous et voir que peut-être notre technique, elle fonctionne un peu mieux pour lutter contre l'itinérance.
Merci.
That is actually consistent with the housing first approach. That's what I mean when I say housing first.
Okay, let's have a few words from Ms. Keller-Herzog.
The Green Party takes an evidence-based approach. If we were to only look at the beautiful words and principles and philosophies laid out in the National Housing Strategy, then if it was implemented, then we would all be probably not here talking about a crisis. But what's actually happening is that this crisis is being downloaded to our cities. If I look at, I'm here in Ottawa Centre. If I look at what's happened here, the city had a proposal for $15 million for 125, that's not so many, new affordable housing units. The funding that we received in Ottawa Centre from the federal government was 1/10. It was $600,000, clearly insufficient.
Okay, did I forget Mr. Poilievre?
Thank you very much. First of all, we do support housing first. We've always believed that the first thing that you need to provide someone who is without a home is the home before you can provide the whole other array of services that they might require to get their life on a positive track. But, you know, the other parties will continue to debate about who can spend the most the fastest, as long as governmental policies are restricting the construction of supply by limiting increasing the cost of construction, the administrative and regulatory and taxation costs associated with housing. You will not get more housing from more spending. You will just get more expensive housing. And that's why you need to remove these governmental obstacles to clear the way so that we can actually increase the total supply of houses available for people to live in.
Okay, thank you. Just to follow up on some of your points, I'm wondering if we can just take a little step back here. What we're talking about here, I think, is driving homelessness down, getting more people into homes. Is it possible? I mean, I think the goal of Housing First and many groups involved in homelessness would really say, let's try to go to zero. Is that possible, and is it possible soon? What would you do to get us there? And because I left Mr. Poilievre to the end last time, let's start with him.
Of course it's possible, and it should be our aspiration. We live in, as I said earlier, one of the most sparsely populated and largest land masses in the world. We should be able to make the space available for everyone to have a roof over their head and a dignified place in which to live. But there is now an abundance of academic literature on the left and the right showing that restrictive policies imposed by local governments and state and provincial governments, depending on your jurisdiction, keep low-income people away from job opportunities and drive up inequality. Yes, they increase home prices for people who already have a very large home, but they actually drive down opportunity for everyone else, and that's why we need to clear the way for the market to provide more housing for everyone.
Okay, Mr. Vaughan?
If the Conservatives think that the private sector is going to solve the homelessness crisis in the country, I know an insurance agent that can sell you some insurance. Quite frankly, it's not going to happen. The issue is this. This sector requires housing with supports. You have to do both, and our program does exactly that. It was doubled in the first budget. It went from a budget of $100 million. It was frozen for 10 years under the Conservatives, and it's now at over $200 million a year. It's $2.2 billion for the next 10 years. That's the capital program side of things. It also provides sorts because we listened to Quebec and we made it a more holistic program. We're also bringing in the Canada Housing Benefit, which is a rent supplement program to extend the support for people that need rent. But the most critically important thing in this campaign is stepping up on addictions, stepping up on mental health for veterans and Indigenous homeless personnel, people in this country. And we have got to find a way to bring additional resources for the supports that make that housing viable so that people get the support they need. On the issue of one particular project in Ottawa, one particular project does not tell the story of a $55 billion program, and it's a 10-year program, not a $15 billion.
Madame Nadeau.
15-year program.
Oui, en fait, le programme Housing First ou Logement d'abord a été premièrement amené par les conservateurs, effectivement, et c'est une vision plutôt restrictive de justement donner de l'argent et de la subvention juste pour le logement. Alors que, justement, nous, au Québec, on a vraiment une vision plus globale. Et si on continue à s'entêter dans une façon de juste, je te donne un logement et après, tu vas trouver une job, clairement, mon collègue du Parti conservateur n'a pas travaillé beaucoup avec des personnes en situation d'itinérance. C'est au-delà de ça, les problématiques qu'ils vivent. Et oui, c'est possible d'enrayer l'itinérance au Canada, mais ça va être possible quand on va avoir de la volonté politique, puis quand on va arrêter de donner des cadeaux à nos amis riches avec l'évasion fiscale, puis quand on va commencer enfin à investir pour les gens qui en ont vraiment besoin.
Okay, Ms. Keller-Herzog.
I think clearly if we prioritize an issue, we are able to address it. However, if we're simply kicking the can forward and we're telling the city of Ottawa, in my particular example, that, oh, in 2021, maybe there'll be some funding for you. Well, that's not good enough. The situation is dire now in this city, and we know it's also dire in many other cities across Canada. Inequality has been increasing in Canada over the past 30 years, and I would hold to account both of the old parties. They have permitted this to happen. The trend is continuing. And just letting developers more unfettered access to all opportunities, not using the federal assets to address the situation is not a solution at all.
Okay, Ms. MacEwen.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible, but only if we make a massive investment in non-market housing in this country. And I would absolutely agree with you with the approach. It can't be housing first where it's an apartment and a resume. It has to be near supports that you need for mental health. And it has to be in concert with rolling back some of the austerity that we've faced at the federal government level and at the provincial government level. Veterans are homeless because they're not getting the pension that they deserve. People with mental health are homeless because there's no way to get a mental health provider in this country. You can't unless you have enough money to pay for it. If you don't have enough money to get a doctor, you're SOL until you show up in the emergency room.
Merci. Nous sommes déjà rendus au troisième thème. Je veux saluer la discipline et le respect dont fait preuve les candidats. Alors bravo, continuons sur cette voie. La question va s'adresser à Mme Nadeau. Nous voulons maintenant mettre l'accent sur le logement communautaire, social, sans but lucratif et coopératif. Plus de 600 000 ménages canadiens habitent des logements sociaux ou des coopératives au Canada, mais la demande et les listes d'attente pour ces logements continuent d'augmenter. Sans l'aide au logement, des milliers de familles canadiennes risquent l'éviction et l'itinérance. Est-ce que votre parti a établi un plan pour augmenter l'offre de logements communautaires au Canada? Votre parti continuera-t-il les programmes de supplément au loyer pour les 380 000 ménages à faible revenu qui dépendent de l'aide fédérale au loyer au-delà de la prolongation de 10 ans de la stratégie nationale du logement? Does your party have a plan to increase the supply of community housing in Canada? And would your party continue to rent subsidy programs for the over 380,000 low-income Canadians households that rely on federal renting assistance beyond the 10-year extension in the National Housing Strategy? Alors, Madame Nadeau, à vous la parole pour 1 minute.
Oui, bien, merci beaucoup de me donner la parole sur cet enjeu-là. Et comme plusieurs le savent, le Bloc québécois, on se présente seulement dans la province du Québec. Donc, évidemment, on défend beaucoup les intérêts, aussi la vision québécoise de faire les choses. Au Québec, on a un programme qui s'appelle Accès Logis, qui est en 3 volets. Et c'est, oui, le logement communautaire est au-delà du Housing First. C'est vraiment de créer des logements sociaux et aussi d'éviter la gentrification. Ça veut dire qu'on a des gens un petit peu partout dans nos quartiers pour éviter de créer des ghettos et faire en sorte que c'est plus difficile de vraiment s'en sortir et de faire des liens avec d'autres personnes. Le Bloc québécois s'engage, oui, à maintenir les investissements et en fait, on aimerait ça les augmenter jusqu'à temps que les investissements en logement abordable et logement communautaire atteignent 1% du budget du gouvernement du Canada. Donc oui, on a l'intention d'y monter. On va sûrement me dire qu'il n'y a plus d'argent dans les coffres. Je vais vous répondre, arrêtez d'acheter des pipelines, il va en avoir.
Madame MacEwen, rebuttal?
I mean, what else can you say? Yeah, I completely agree. And the NDP has actually proposed a rental housing benefit that would come into effect earlier and help more people. And when I'm knocking on doors and I talk to seniors and I say, oh, we're going to build 500,000 new units of affordable housing, they're like, yeah, but I don't want to move. I just want to be able to afford where I am right now. And I say, oh, we actually have a plan for you. If you're spending more than 30% of your pre-tax income on rent, we have a subsidy that will be up to $5,000 a year to help you afford to stay in place where you are. And that will also help to bridge the gap between now and when we get that affordable housing built.
Merci, Madame MacEwen. Monsieur Poilievre, à vous.
Oui, merci. Évidemment, nous allons appuyer les programmes qui sont déjà en place. At the same time, I'd like to respond to something Adam said. Frankly, Adam, you were at City Hall in Toronto when the costs of bureaucratic red tape, delays, endless delays for construction, and higher taxes have driven up the cost and driven out minorities and low-income people from places where there are lots of opportunities. You are not the solution to our housing problem. You are the problem. The reality is, you're saying you don't want the private sector involved. The young people who are looking for a home these days, they don't want to live in a government house. They want to live in their own house, and they want politicians like you to get out of the way and let those houses be built.
Le tour devrait aller à Mme Keller-Herzog, mais je vais passer tout de suite à M. Vaughan, so you can rebut Mr. Poilievre right away.
Well, as a city councillor, I think if you talk to the Canadian home builders, you'll find that my riding got cut in half because of the amount of housing I was involved in delivering, which was not just new market housing, it was also new co-ops, new supportive housing, housing for hotel workers, housing right across the spectrum, including a total rebuild of a housing co-op that had been neglected for 20 years but by a previous NDP councillor. So I will not take a backseat to anybody in terms of the provision of housing. I think I've done more in terms of delivering housing than perhaps you have done in your entire lifetime in my career at City Hall. But the issue is this, is that the question here is about co-op housing and about housing that in community settings. We have renewed and saved the subsidies for the co-op sector. We have created a pathway for re-enrollment for the lost subsidies. The Canada Housing Benefit is a 10-year program that's got accords signed with the provinces, so we don't put money in the front door of the provinces like Doug Ford, take it out the back door.
Merci,
as well,
Monsieur Vaughan.
repairs, and there's so much more to talk about.
Merci. Madame Keller-Herzog, à vous la parole.
Merci. Je suis d'accord avec l'autre Angela ici, que les personnes âgées ont besoin de soutien pour rester dans leur propre maison. But beyond that, we also need to address, again, the supply of rental housing. The private sector is simply not interested in creating housing for people that have $500 a month in rent to pay. It simply isn't happening, and it's not going to be happening. So unfortunately, Mr. Poilievre's proposals will not meet any take-up. So supply and demand is not working at that end of the market. We should call on our institutions to address this. What we need is a Ministry of Housing, which used to exist in the form of the Ministry of Urban Affairs under the Trudeau the First.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Follow-up questions for everyone. How would the federal government work with provinces and municipalities to increase social and co-op housing? I'll start with you, Madame Keller-Herzog.
I think that what is required is a certainty of long-term financing. Obviously, housing has longer amortization periods than many other investments, and we should be using the Canada Housing Mortgage Corporation to supply some of that financing. Further, I think that land often is a significant part in the cost of creating new housing. We have a good example here in Ottawa, the Le Breton Flats. The federal government, under the Liberal Party, is looking to monetize this land at the same time as we have a 10,000 family waiting list for supported social housing. So why not put federal assets, put that land in a public trust, and then invite nonprofits and co-ops to develop that land?
Merci, Madame Keller-Herzog. Madame MacEwen?
Oui. Yeah, so what the NDP has proposed to do is, because it's been so long since there was support for co-op housing, that we would kickstart the construction of co-op and social and not-for-profit housing through fast-tracking funds and streamlining the application process by setting up an organization to help people do that, because there is some great co-op housing in Ottawa. It needs money to help with repairs. As Adam said, they're often left to not be repaired, and there's not sufficient funds allocated to that. So we would allocate some money to repairs, and we would allocate money to helping people get up and going and learning how to do that. And I fully think that we should be using NCC lands to build that non-market housing that people need.
Merci, Madame Nadeau.
Selon moi, un gouvernement, ça sert à faire de la redistribution de la richesse. Donc, oui, je crois que le gouvernement doit intervenir et doit investir beaucoup plus. Il faut comprendre aussi que depuis 1995, et libéraux et conservateurs avaient arrêté de subventionner les logements sociaux. Je remercie le gouvernement qui est présentement en place, qui a recommencé l'investissement, mais c'est trop peu. Et j'espère pas trop tard. Même le directeur parlementaire du budget reconnaît que l'argent qui a été mis, c'est bien, mais c'est pas vraiment une augmentation des budgets. Au-delà d'avoir une maison, et je ne peux que réagir, que ma maison a soit subventionnée une partie par le gouvernement ou que ma maison a été construite par un promoteur immobilier, les gens qui vivent en situation de pauvreté, ils veulent juste une maison, peu importe d'où ce qu'elle vient. Mais ils veulent aussi une maison sécuritaire. À Gatineau, on a beaucoup de logements sociaux qui ont eu des problèmes d'amiante. Puis ça a été un des effets du fait qu'on a arrêté d'investir dans le logement social. Donc, il faut aussi mettre assez d'argent pour rénover ces maisons-là parce que oui, on a le droit d'avoir des maisons qui sont sécuritaires.
Merci, Madame Nadeau. Monsieur Poilievre, à vous la parole.
Yes, I think we need maximum flexibility. Our approach is we're going to continue to increase the Canada Social Transfer by 3% a year and allow the provinces the ability to put those dollars to work in things like housing. But we need maximum flexibility at the local level as well. And you know, I keep being told that the market doesn't want to provide affordable housing. The truth, that is just not true. When the governments make the construction of housing increasingly expensive, then the rents are increasingly expensive to pay off the cost of the original construction. We need to reduce those costs, but further, we need to allow more flexibility. For example, why aren't we allowing more secondary suites in our urban centers where there's unused space, where seniors need the income, and where they'd like to avail some of that space to a young person, for example, who might pay rent to use it?
Merci, Monsieur Poilievre. Lastly, Mr. Adam Vaughan.
So we need more co-ops. It is critically important to understand that from the last 30 years, they are the sector which has survived with the strongest housing programs in the country, but the cracks are starting to show in terms of repairs. So we have extended financing past 50 years. That's one of the ways to make it affordable. We have also provided grants to get them started, loans to get them financed and under construction. We've also reinforced and protected the subsidies for the next 10 years and put all the co-ops in the same renewal program, as well as creating a path to renewing some of the ones that were lost under the Harper government. And we've also put a housing screen on all surplus land to make sure federal lands are available to cities and provinces that want to build, to make sure we support that. The other thing is repairs. The NDP just referenced it for the first time. The word repair does not exist in their platform. If you don't repair public housing, and the $1.3 billion that we sent to the City of Toronto to finance and fund the repair of Toronto community housing, if you don't step up on repairs as well as construction, we are going to lose housing stock faster than we can possibly build it. That's the finding in the City of Toronto.
Merci.
We have to change that.
Merci, Monsieur Vaughan.
I believe we now get to actually have a question from the audience. So if you could please introduce yourself, and Ms. Keller-Herzog will ask you to be the first to answer this question.
Having technical problems here. In the language of my ancestors, Niit, hello, my name is Margaret Foe. I'm the CEO for the Aboriginal Housing Management Association in British Columbia. Founded on the right to self-determination, AMA is a grassroots organization and the first of its kind in this country to accept lateral devolution of administration for over 40 urban housing providers in BC, having delivered nearly $200 million in subsidy and capital renewal in the last 5 years. I'd like to start off by acknowledging we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg territory, and Toyoksim, thank you all for being here. As you all know, First Nations people across Canada have higher housing challenges than the rest of the population in Canada. For First Nations people living in urban and rural centres, we battle overcrowding, we battle homelessness, and we battle deeper, higher core needs than any other population. My question would be, if your government is elected, what will you do, in particular with regards to urban Indigenous populations, to raise the standard of living and housing for them to that of the non-Indigenous population?
I think that the Indigenous housing needs is a complex file, and it's not really possible to give a one-minute answer to solve. There are structures coming out of the Indian Act and other legal structures which reinforce the colonial relations and keep Indigenous populations in poverty. So, for example, in terms of financing from CMHC, there's legal strictures saying that Indigenous on-reserve populations are not eligible. So there's all kinds of structures that reinforce the reality that we have. I think for the urban Indigenous population, this is also a poverty problem, and the Green Party proposes a guaranteed livable income as a floor for everyone to stand on, to make it equal across the country, urban and rural for that matter.
Thank you very much. Madame Nadeau.
Thank you. I really appreciate your question. We're at a really important moment in our history where it seems like it's possible to engage in meaningful reconciliation if we, as the Government of Canada, release some control over how things happen. And so I think that's what needs to happen. I think we need to engage with Indigenous service providers in our community. I've met with Indigenous service providers in Ottawa, West Nepean. There's a youth shelter. There's a shelter for Inuit populations actually in Ottawa, West Nepean. So there's, I think that it has to be at that local level and engage in municipalities to talk with those communities directly about what they need and engage them in finding the answers that they think will work for their communities.
Thank you very much.
But we have to put the money behind it and withdraw the control.
Madame Nadeau.
Oui, je suis tellement contente qu'enfin le logement autochtone fasse partie et soit question aussi présente dans un débat. Comme souverainiste québécoise, je ne peux m'imaginer, je n'aime pas quand que le gouvernement fédéral vienne me dire comment gérer mon territoire et je ne peux que ressentir de la sympathie pour les nations autochtones qui, trop longtemps, ont subi un traitement paternaliste du Canada. Et enfin, la réconciliation s'en vient. Au Québec, on a eu la commission Vient, où il y a eu plusieurs recommandations, où on a écouté. Moi, évidemment qu'il faut qu'on mette l'argent, évidemment qu'il faut qu'on travaille avec vous, mais moi, j'ai envie que les solutions viennent des milieux autochtones parce que c'est vous qui connaissez le territoire, c'est vous qui connaissez vos réalités. Nous, on est là pour vous aider parce que trop longtemps, on était là pour mettre des bâtons dans vos roues.
Mr. Poilievre.
Thank you for your question. I agree with you strongly that we need to devolve more control to Aboriginal organizations to give them the autonomy. This is one area where I actually agree with the comment of the Green Party, where she said that the legal structures in this country discriminate against and hold back the First Nations communities. I got a call from Chief Bear when I was the Employment and Social Development Minister saying it was impossible for him to make it mortgages available for his people on his reserve because of land use policies related to CMHC. Without a mortgage, you can't get a credit history, you can't get collateral, and you can't build equity for eventual retirement. We need to work with willing and interested Aboriginal communities to change those land use policies so where people want to own their own home and get a traditional mortgage just like any other Canadian, they have the opportunity to do so.
Mr. Vaughan.
That approach failed. In fact, I think only 11 mortgages in 3 years is the $300 million fund that lies dormant because Indigenous communities, in particular on reserve, do not want to privatize their land. But the real challenge we have in Indigenous housing in urban centres is the problem we're running into in Ontario, where and this wasn't part of the Parliamentary Budget Office report, but we tripled transfers to the provinces, in particular to support lapsing housing agreements, and none of the Indigenous co-ops in Ontario are getting the support they require that we've funded from the province of Ontario. They have been told to come the federal government, despite the fact Ford has those dollars in his bank. That is wrong. We are committed to an urban Indigenous housing strategy. It must be urban Indigenous-led, designed, and delivered, and it's absolutely critical that we also understand that this is a process that we will not achieve reconciliation without. When Robert Byers from Nemerand House in Regina talks about the profound need to get the land back under your feet and to get your housing built, he leans into Jesse Thistle's excellent definition of what constitutes Indigenous homelessness. This country must achieve on this file in the next Parliament. All parties need to be committed to it. Without an urban Indigenous housing strategy, it is impossible to solve homelessness in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. I'd just like to follow up, and maybe in the case of on-reserve housing in particular, because I know we were just discussing urban Indigenous housing. For on-reserve housing, about half of those Indigenous households on reserve live below the national housing standard for adequacy and suitability. So what specific actions then, if you could provide some concrete examples, what specific actions would your party take to immediately address what is the most acute housing situation in this country? And we'll start with Ms. Keller-Herzog.
I think that we can look at both the practical and the strategic actions that can be taken. I think that one of the problems we have in especially far north community is the cost of materials, and the cost of shipping is horrendous. And often the types of materials that are shipped up are not adequate to deal with the different climate, which is part of the reason why you get the mold and you get the very inadequate housing. So I think that some very practical, concrete measures need to be taken on that front in terms of finding climate relevant materials that will stand up, and also with a view to the changing climate. I think that on the more strategic level, we have a situation where under the Indian Act, there's special permissions that the government needs to authorize building and maintenance of housing. So some of those governance structures, I think, need to be completely reviewed with self-government.
Thank you, Ms. Keller-Herzog.
And getting out of the Indian
Thank you, ma'am.
Act.
Ms. MacEwen.
Yeah, this is because of a long history of underfunding and not prioritizing safe living conditions for Indigenous people, and I think that you're exactly right. We need to scrap the colonial relationship, the colonial legal system that enforces that. When I was in the Naval Reserves, we visited an Indigenous community that had voted actually to be dry, but they missed the deadline for the government to get permission for it. So the government said, no, you're not allowed to be dry. You have to wait till next year to meet the deadline. It's ridiculous. You don't understand how patronizing this relationship is unless you've lived it or know someone who has. So we need to increase the funding. We need to get rid of the colonial relationships.
Thank you very much. Madame Nadeau.
Justement, au Québec, on a eu la commission Vient où un des enjeux était avec le logement. Une des recommandations, c'était que la Société d'habitation du Québec, là, je sais que c'est une compétence provinciale, mais en concertation avec les compétences fédérales, c'est là que nous on rentre, élabore avant le 1er avril 2020 des propositions d'action pour combler le manque de logement au Nunavik. Eh bien, il va falloir qu'on étende ça pour que dans l'ensemble du Canada, on élabore les propositions puis qu'on ait vérifié. Premièrement, il faut savoir vraiment quel est l'état. Il faut savoir combien ça va coûter réparer tout ça. Il faut vraiment travailler avec eux. Une fois qu'on aura vraiment su l'ampleur des dégâts, enfin, on va pouvoir s'asseoir avec les communautés autochtones et bien travailler avec eux. Nous, on est l'outil. Vous, vous êtes les gestionnaires de votre terrain. Et je peux ressentir une certaine sympathie aussi de... Vous dites, vous voulez la réconciliation, vous voulez qu'on soit traité d'égal à égal, mais il y a des communautés autochtones présentement dans le pays qui disent non, vous ne passerez pas avec votre pétrole sur mon terrain, puis on dit, c'est pas grave, on va y aller pareil. Donc
Merci.
le respect, il commence maintenant.
Merci. Mr. Poilievre.
Well, contrary to what Mr. Vaughan said earlier, the reason that the First Nations communities who want the ability to offer their citizens to get more commercial mortgages is not because there's no interest in it. It's because your government has made it impossible for it to occur. You have refused to work with these communities to allow for changes in land use for it to occur. And no, it doesn't require privatization of lands. We also need to talk about creating opportunity on reserves. I think of what the incredible entrepreneurs and the reserves in the Okanagan Valley have done in Penticton and Osoyoos, where they've opened tourism enterprises and other businesses that are actually generating revenue on reserve to fight poverty, provide health care services and housing for their people.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vaughan.
The issue here is on reserve housing, and part of the way you have to solve that is to fill in that fourth quadrant of the housing circle, which is the urban Indigenous piece. If we had that quadrant, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls situation would not be the size of the tragedy and the depth of the tragedy that it is. And in terms of what we're doing, it's a $2.2 billion investment over the last 4 years to increase and retrofit the homes to make them better, safer, and larger, and to make sure that we have a new housing program underway. We have stepped up in this campaign to announce that there will be an Indigenous-led infrastructure program. When you give it to the provinces, we've seen what Ontario does. They play politics with the money, and the last people that get the dollars are, in fact, the Indigenous people. The other component of the housing strategy I think is critically important is the $40,000 interest-free loans. Those are eligible to Indigenous-based on-reserve housing providers. And as well, we have also opened up the entire CMHC program so that all Indigenous applicants are dealt with as equal players. They are, in fact, Canadian as well. And so we're making sure that the non-specific Indigenous programs also enroll Indigenous applications. That's one of the ways we've supported the program with build-out.
Thank you. Now, I know Margaret's been looking at me because she'd like to ask a follow-up. And so we'll go in reverse order to answer. But Margaret, the floor is yours again.
Okay, thank you. I just want to pick up on a thread that I think got missed in all of this discussion. It's easy because of the very legal constructs, the colonial legal constructs a few of you have referenced in your answers. It's easy to focus on the on reserve, which we don't like to use the language on reserve because it wasn't our language. This is a construct of the colonial government, all right? So what I wanted to talk about is the fact that 87% of all Indigenous peoples reside in urban, rural, and northern centers, not on reserves. So my question, again, was more about what is your platform going to do to address the reality that 87% of the Indigenous population lives in urban centers? What is your solution to that?
So, Mr. Vaughan?
As I said, it's creating an urban Indigenous housing strategy and infrastructure fund that is Indigenous-led, designed, and delivered. It's reviving the old Urban Indigenous Housing Authority across the country. There are good, strong programs provincially. They need to be unified nationally. It's about making those investments and making sure that we step up to support that, but we also create a self-directed fund that grows over time in the same way that CMHC has grown over time to support the housing programs. It's also about taking things like Reaching Home, the new profile of the homelessness program, and where you see large Indigenous populations on the street in places like Winnipeg and Regina, and as you move out west, the populations grow, but it's also a problem in the east, is that you've got to stop asking nonprofits from the non-Indigenous sector to lead these programs, and we have to transition those programs to Indigenous-led housing and homelessness programs. Additionally, opening up the full scope of every single CMHC program to all housing providers, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, whether distinction-based or non-distinction-based. The Inuit program that was talked about here was not funded through an Indigenous housing program. It was funded through a regular CMHC program. That transition must happen.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Poilievre.
Thank you very much. It's both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because the Indigenous population faces a lot of difficulty in our urban settings with poverty, and other social difficulties that have been imposed over time. We need to address those through everything from providing housing to recovery from addiction to addressing other concerns related to the social difficulties of living in an urban setting. But the opportunity is that this young population can fill the labor market needs of our growing economy. We need to ensure that Aboriginal youth have the opportunity to complete apprenticeships for long-term jobs and prosperity in our trades, to qualify into our professions, and to have all the training necessary to fill the labor shortages that are so desperate in so many urban settings across this country. We need to see this as an opportunity and lift people up at the same time.
Thank you very much. Madame Nadeau.
Oui, au Bloc québécois, on s'engage à contribuer financièrement aux initiatives de logements sociaux pour les Autochtones en milieu urbain, effectivement aussi, parce que justement, comme vous l'avez dit, il y a plusieurs des Autochtones qui vivent en milieu urbain. Et justement, c'est là où la spécificité québécoise est intéressante, parce que quand on parle de logements sociaux, c'est avec un organisme communautaire, et c'est justement en communauté qu'on se relève. Donc, pour éviter de faire en sorte que chacun et chacun de son bord avec le Housing First, des logements sociaux pour Autochtones, ou qui sont gérés par des personnes autochtones, puis que c'est vraiment entre vous que vous allez pouvoir vous relever et travailler ensemble. C'est vraiment vers ça qu'il faut tendre.
Ms. MacEwen.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think that Indigenous service providers in the urban areas have to be involved. Ottawa is a particularly interesting area because there's also the national, the Assembly of First Nations is here, the Métis organizations are here, and so when you're addressing these issues, there's not one nation in Canada, so how do you provide culturally appropriate solutions for people when they're coming from across Canada to Ottawa? And so I really think that we just have to sit down, we have to put the resources in place. As Adam says so eloquently, it has to be Indigenous-led, but what does that look like? How do we make that happen? I think we have to put some land in the picture and say, here's some land, here's some houses.
Ms. Keller-Herzog.
I agree. I think Ottawa is interesting because we also have a very large population of Inuit. So I agree with what Ms. MacEwen has said, is that each particular community should have a say in parts of the solution that will address their particular needs and cultural sensitivities. That said, I think we also should be looking at the reduction and addressing of poverty in a multidimensional way. I've already mentioned the guaranteed livable income so that we don't have anybody in this country falling between the cracks, but we all have a floor to stand on. The Green Party of Canada also thinks that we need a national mental health strategy, and I'm really glad that Mr. Poilievre is acknowledging that we have addictions problem in this country. We need to treat that as a health issue rather than criminalizing it, which is both more effective and less costly. And I think that that will also be part of the solution.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move on to talking about mortgage rules, which have generated a lot of discussion, and I thank you all for your sticking to the time restraints and being so respectful of each other. Let's hope we can get through the next section doing the same thing. I believe we have another question from the audience on mortgage rules.
My name is Kevin Krieger, and I'm a realtor with the Toronto Real Estate Board. The mortgage stress test came into effect in 2018 with the intent to protect borrowers if interest rates went up. However, many borrowers, especially first-time home buyers, are saying that the new requirements in the current stress test are too restrictive and are a major barrier to them entering the housing market. Does your party support adjusting the stress test, or would you keep it as is?
We'll start with Ms. MacEwen for 1 minute.
A whole minute about the stress test.
We'll do another round.
All right. So my husband was actually a student in California from 2006 to 2010. So I have a particular view on this. The people who lost their homes were low-income families, racialized families, who had been following this dream of home ownership. I think we put too much emphasis on home ownership. People really react negatively when I say that. But I think that we should look at affordability writ large and not necessarily be encouraging people to buy houses that are too big for them, that they can't afford. I think that we should get rid of this value that we have to owning a house, that somehow that makes you like a secure adult. Adults rent, and that's okay. and depending on how much you're paying in interest or how much you're borrowing, it might actually make sense. And then put money that you're saving aside into other savings.
Okay, Adam Vaughan.
Well, the stress test was put in place as part of a series of measures by the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and that is an independent officer, a regulatory officer, that sets financial policy to protect not just the housing market, but also the banking system, the financial sector in the country. And so any party that says they're going to override that independent regulator is really starting to play politics with some pretty sound fundamentals in the economy. Jim Flaherty was correct when he brought in the test. He was brought in for the right reasons. We cannot see high household debt and other forms of debt trigger a housing collapse that would be devastating to thousands and millions of families across this country, would see their equity disappear. And so we have to manage this differently. We were appreciative of the fact that regionally it can be broken out. And as I said at the beginning, we're starting to look at approaches to that. But the real things we've been doing is creating pathways to home ownership that don't introduce new risks to the market, because introducing risks to the market would not be a good thing for people that currently own their homes, and what could trigger the collapse that we all saw in 2008.
Okay, Mr. Poilievre.
We do support a stress test, the existence of a stress test. The problem with the existing OSFI stress test is that it applies on one of the problems, is that it applies on renewals of existing mortgages. So someone has already been approved, they're already living in the house, they already have the mortgage, but it comes to term. Now OSFI is going to require them to get another stress test if and only if they changed lenders. That means they're stuck with their existing lender, and that lender, usually a big bank, knows it, and therefore can impose unfavorable terms on the borrower. I believe that people should have the ability to shop around. Adam's party believes that they shouldn't, that they should be stuck with the bank and take whatever deal the bank throws at them. And I think that is fundamentally flawed, and that's why we will get rid of this, in cases of renewals, we will get rid of the stress test, and we will renew the stress test for all other circumstances.
Madame Nadeau.
Oui, je dois dire que je suis assez d'accord avec ma collègue du nouveau Parti démocratique. Moi aussi, des fois, quand je parle de mes visions par rapport au logement, je ne suis pas toujours appréciée. Le stress test, je suis d'accord avec ça parce que j'ai envie qu'on s'assure qu'il n'y ait pas une autre crise économique. J'entends ce que M. Poilievre dit en lien avec le renouvellement. Peut-être qu'il y a là aussi à avoir une certaine flexibilité et surtout une régionalisation parce que le stress test a été mis en place pour des places où il y avait déjà des bulles immobilières comme à Vancouver et Toronto, qui n'est pas nécessairement le cas au Québec. Mais de façon générale, quand on parle de logement, il faut revoir notre conception du logement. Il faut revoir la nécessité de vivre en banlieue avec une piscine puis avec 2 chiens. Il faut revoir notre nécessité de s'étendre sur le territoire au lieu d'habiter notre territoire de façon beaucoup plus intelligente et beaucoup plus écologique.
Okay, Ms. Keller-Herzog.
I think that the objective of preventing excessive indebtedness and a bubble which can then be burst at the bottom end of the real estate market is definitely something we want to avoid. But we have another big problem, and that problem is climate change. So when somebody here earlier said that the word renovation or repair hadn't once appeared in the NDP policy, well, the Green Party is proposing the biggest home renovation program ever, where we're saying we need to energy retrofit all of the housing stock in this country. And we need to think about how that can be financed. And I wouldn't want there to be a barrier to home equity loans where households are trying to lock in future energy savings by switching from heating and cooling systems, which are causing greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to think about green mortgages that do not get prevented by the stress test.
Let's do another round here on some of the measures that have come up during the campaign to encourage home ownership. I want to talk about 30-year mortgages in particular, and if you want to go back a little bit at the stress test too in your responses, that will work as well. So let's start with Ms. MacEwen. Your party is proposing extending mortgages to 30 years again, and the head of the CMHC has called that reckless. How do you respond to that?
I don't think that 5 years is reckless. I wouldn't go any further than 30 years. Certainly what happens when you're taking that longer mortgage is that you're just paying more money because you're extending the amount of time that interest is accruing on the debt that you owe. But I think that's one way that's really practical of letting people get into the home ownership market, because what tends to happen here is the way that we structure home ownership is that it increases inequality. Lots of millennials and lots of Gen Xers have parents that help them buy their first home. And if you don't have parents that can help you buy your first home, then you're kind of stuck out. You're seeing housing prices increasing faster and your wages aren't increasing. So it is important to think of those equity issues when we're talking about housing affordability.
Okay, Mr. Vaughan?
Well, the NDP plan on home ownership, first-time buyer home ownership, is to effectively double down on Stephen Harper's home credit tax plan. And when it was released, Jack Layton called it a dribble of a policy. You guys have now double dribbled, which means we take the ball away from you. But the reality is this, is that we have got to create pathways to home ownership. So we've done 3 very specific things. We have done the shared mortgage equity agreements, the first-time buyer incentive, which allows you to save money in terms of us cost-sharing the down payment, and that that means that you save money instead of a 30-year mortgage, which means that you pay more interest to the bank. So we'd rather you kept the money than the bank keeps the money. Secondly, we've allowed you to transfer more of your RSPs across the home ownership program, and that allows you to choose how you save and how you build your financial future. And then finally, the $40,000 interest-free loan, which stands in stark contrast to the Green and NDP plans. This allows you to fix your home, energy retrofit it, and live in it in a safer, more humane way while fighting climate change. These policies are a comprehensive approach to first-time buyers and to home ownership, and they don't introduce
Thanks.
risk into the market.
Okay, Mr. Poilievre.
Quality.
Well, actually, Adam, you spent a lot of time talking about everybody else on the stage. You are introducing new risk in the market. You seem to claim now all of a sudden that debt is a bad thing, which I think is extraordinary as an admission from the Liberal Party, which has just released a platform that proudly boasts of adding $100 billion of brand new public debt. Let me finish. I let you finish. I let you finish. I'm sorry. I know you'd like to shout me down because you don't want this to be known, but your $100 billion in additional debt will lead to massive tax increases on working class people, and those same people will find it much harder to pay a mortgage because they'll be too busy paying interest on your debt.
Madame Nadeau.
Je ne peux m'empêcher de réagir à ce qui vient de se dire. En lien avec le 30 ans, là, oui, effectivement, on pourrait rétablir le 30 ans pour les taux hypothécaires. Mais moi, personnellement, quand on me dit la dette, présentement, je veux juste rappeler que le Canada, pays du G7, est le pays qui a la plus faible dette par rapport à son PIB. Donc moi, ça ne m'empêche pas de dormir le soir, la dette. Donc c'est pas quelque chose de ma génération qu'on a peur. Je n'ai pas peur de la dette des libéraux. J'ai plus peur de la dette environnementale que si les conservateurs gagnent, et même parfois les politiques des libéraux aussi, qui vont nous laisser. Donc moi, personnellement, là, quand on essaie de me faire peur avec la dette, j'embarque pas du tout. Et effectivement, une maison, ben, c'est un investissement. Puis ben, quand le gouvernement fédéral investit dans des infrastructures, ben, c'est un investissement, c'est pas une dette.
Okay, Ms. Keller-Herzog.
I'm wondering if I can ask the audience, for those of you who are homeowners, how many of you have actually refinanced? And by that, I mean extended, continued, borrowed against the equity that you have, and effectively extended the amortization of the debt against your principal asset. Okay, I see that there's some hands. I'm sorry, I'm an economist. I hope that wasn't too complicated. But I think that for the middle class, the upper middle class, and the older generation, these are financial tools which are available and accessible to us. So I don't think that it makes sense to start calling a 30-year amortization period like a huge disaster and risk. I think that's just fear-mongering. I think that's a choice that most of us, as we go along, actually undertake, because there is also an affordability and an income security crisis at the other end. So as we're struggling to find money to pay for our kids' university fees, these are the paths forward.
Thank you.
Nous voilà déjà rendus à la fin du débat. Nous allons donc permettre à chaque participant de présenter son allocution de clôture de 1 minute dans l'ordre inversé de celui des présentations. Donc, nous allons commencer avec Madame Geneviève Nadeau du Bloc québécois. Closing statement for 1 minute for everybody. Madame Nadeau.
Oui, bien en fait, c'est très intéressant pour moi de participer à ce débat. Merci de l'invitation. Pour conclure, je dirais que dans le fond, tous nos engagements en lien avec l'habitation et le logement, ils doivent viser la justice sociale, s'assurer que chacun ait une chance égale d'avoir un logement. Ils doivent aussi viser la protection de notre environnement parce que c'est l'enjeu de notre siècle. Donc, chacune de nos décisions, on doit avoir ces deux aspects-là derrière la tête. Je dois aussi rappeler que l'entente de Charlottetown reconnaissait le logement comme une compétence exclusive du Québec. Donc, je voudrais juste demander à ces partis fédéralistes autour de moi que si jamais vous prenez le pouvoir, parce qu'il y en a un de vous quatre qui va prendre le pouvoir, de respecter la spécificité québécoise et de vous assurer que vous respectez les engagements la conclusion de Charlottetown. Oui, vous pouvez investir de l'argent dans le logement social, ça va me faire plaisir, mais permettez au Québec de l'investir dans son programme qui répond vraiment aux critères du Québec.
Merci, Madame Nadeau. Next candidate, Madame Angela Keller-Herzog, Green Party.
Thank you for organizing this focused discussion on housing for Canadians. Thanks to all the sponsoring organization. The biggest challenge facing our country is the destabilizing climate. This will affect the housing sector, create new housing issues, but also create new opportunities to address the old problems that we have. Moving to a low-carbon economy means that urban sprawl will be even more costly. Therefore, investments in affordable, rental, supportive, co-op, and social housing in urban cores are a win-win. From the side of the Green Party contribution to this debate, this conversation, I would like you to remember two imperatives that we are committed to. The Green Party is committed to retrofitting the entire building stock of this country. We need to invest in energy efficiency and alternatives. And the Green Party is committed to effectively addressing the growing Canadian housing crisis through supply of affordable housing.
Merci beaucoup. Prochain candidat, M. Pierre Poilievre du Parti conservateur.
You've all seen bidding wars in real estate. Well, you're seeing one on the stage here today. The other party is promising billions upon billions of dollars of uncosted spending, which they claim will make life more affordable. That's right, they'll spend your money and somehow that will make your life more affordable. This is the credit card campaign. The Liberal Party will put tens of billions of dollars on the national credit card before the election and send you the bill for higher taxes after the election, when they no longer need your vote but still need your money. We are the only party that has presented real savings and a costed plan backed up by the Parliamentary Budget Officer to gently phase out the deficit over the next 5 years while providing lower income taxes, GST-free home heat, and a carbon tax-free environment in which every single Canadian can work hard and get ahead. Thank you very much.
Prochain candidat, next candidate, M. Adam Vaughan of the Liberal Party.
Very proud of the National Housing Strategy, a $55 billion program that will lift close to 560,000 Canadians at a core housing need by building, repairing, subsidizing, and supporting people who need supports to live independently. I'm very proud that our government has provided a pathway to first-time home ownership that involves new ways in which we share the risk with first-time home buyers, and we help get them into the market without creating inflation by surging them into the market. But I also want to say this, that the most important issue we have in front of us is the issue on our streets. It will not be solved by the private market. It will be solved by treating homelessness as a health care issue. Poverty may put you there, but health care is what locks you into a life on the streets. Our investments in mental health, addiction, our investments in veterans, and in particular our investments in starting the first ever Indigenous urban housing strategy are about solving that problem once and for all. But finally this, if we don't support Indigenous urban housing as a country, reconciliation is impossible. The numbers that were quoted are absolutely real. You see it on our city streets here in Ottawa the second you cross the street just around the corner. This is a call to action for the country, for cities, for rural communities, and for Indigenous governments to partner up and make sure that we solve this problem once and for all, because we can.
Merci, M. Vaughan. Last speaker, Mme. Angella MacEwen from the NDP.
So many things to address, so little time. Thank you very much for this debate. I learned a lot, and it was very interesting. I love Adam Vaughan's words. They are beautiful, and they make me want to believe that this government has put money behind solving an Indigenous housing crisis and put money behind solving the national housing crisis. But the Parliamentary Budget Officer says that that's simply not true. They are only maintaining current funding. They're not putting money in. Their programs that they're talking about will help people at the high end of the market. It doesn't help people save for a down payment. It doesn't help people put money in the RSPs to take out to put in for the down payment in the first place. So it's not getting at that low end of the market. It's helping the higher end affordability, because when we talk about affordability, that means something different to everyone. It's not getting to that low end. We're not building non-market housing for people that can't afford $500 of rent. It simply isn't feasible for a profit-led organization to provide quality, secure housing at that price. So the government has to step in and solve this with sufficient money and lots of work with local stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Mme. MacEwen. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes tonight's national housing debate. This was a very civilized debate. Let's hope that tomorrow will also be as civilized. We'll have 6 participants. It will be a different show, but congratulations for this very good debate. Now, it is up to you, voters, to make the decision. October 21st is coming soon, 2 weeks from tomorrow. People will be going to vote. And so I would encourage everybody to go and exercise your right to vote.
And before we all take off and go our separate ways, let's first thank you, the audience, for coming out tonight on a Sunday night when you could be doing other things. And to the 5 associations who sponsored tonight's event, so the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, the Canadian Home Builders Association, and the Canadian Real Estate Association. And of course, let us thank our debaters one more time for the evening of insights they provided. So can we please give them a round of applause? And with that, thank you very much and have a good evening.